Tim, welcome to the stage. Welcome to the show. And I've been talking to your aunt a lot, and she's an amazing woman. And from her stories, you sound like an awesome dude. And thank you for your service to this country. And I'm sorry for what you have been through, but feel free to take the mic and talk about that.
Ah, well, can you hear me?
We hear you just fine.
Smashing. Well, thank you for having me, David. It's truly a meritorious occasion to be with such a magnanimous fellow. Don't feel too bad for me. I'm kind of a jerk. No, I would actually say that there's more nuance than just two kinds of people. I would say there's a lot of overlapping circles. It's like a Venn diagram almost. But more or less, there were regular people there who got caught up in something that they weren't expecting, and then there were also agitators. Now we can divide that into all different kinds of things. You did have Antifa there. You did have provocateurs. Maybe they were just there for the wrong reason. Agitators who potentially were DHS or some other form of three-letter agency assets. You definitely had plainclothes officers there. We know that there were FBI agents there. We know that Homeland Security was there. We know that even the Bureau of Prisons was there. This recently was revealed that the CIA had deployed assets there that day. So it's not a conspiracy theory to say that it was a Fedsurrection. The true question is to what extent it was pre-planned by federal assets or agencies. But I would like to think the majority of people there were just normal people who got caught up in something that, frankly, they just weren't expecting. People like me, I showed up in a suit and tie about a half hour before any outer perimeters of the Capitol were breached. So the majority of people there that day were like me. They had no idea that there was even a perimeter. So when these perimeters were breached by people like FBI informant James Knowles, um, they had no idea they were even trespassing. And so when you look at video that I've released from my phone after 3 years of incarceration, you can actually see that the majority of people there were an ocean of people chanting USA, singing God Bless America, and or even chanting Christ is King. If you look at the video from the perspective of someone who's there, it's an ocean of people, and you have no idea if there are agitators at the front. It seems very peaceful until you get close to the action at the front, at which point the perspective is it is actually the police who are attacking the crowd. Now, again, there were agitators there who were there to incite this, to turn it into this self-fulfilling prophecy. But has anybody stopped for 5 seconds to question the narrative of people with thin blue line flags fighting the cops? That makes absolutely no sense. So there's clearly more to the story there. And I would actually say that for the most part, the Capitol Police weren't even the problem. I think for the most part, it was actually the Metro PD who were the ones throwing flashbang grenades into the middle of peaceful crowds. So there were a lot of factors there. There were informants there that were planted there with bullhorns, trying to agitate people, carnival barkers on both sides of the Capitol building that seemed to be coordinating with each other to plan things. A lot of different breaches of the Capitol building on the inside and outside were happening simultaneously. It was a coordinated event. It was not an insurrection by Trump supporters, but we can't get bogged into this false dichotomy, this Hegelian dialectic where we think that everyone was all good or all bad. There was a mixture. And so we need to look at this not through the lens of CNN or Fox News. We need to look at this through the lens of what is a color revolution? How do governments do these sorts of things? We've been doing this for years, and this is the history major in me talking, but when you look at, say, the color revolutions we've sponsored throughout the world, and especially third world countries, especially during the Cold War, post Cold War, this is exactly the sort of thing we do. Most people just aren't trained to see it. It's just rare we see it on U.S. soil. There were a lot of moving pieces in law. One of the things I like to say is that January 6th fits what I would call a hub and spoke conspiracy or hub and wheel conspiracy, where there are all these moving pieces that don't even know that they're a part of a larger scheme. The average person there had no idea that there was even going to be something happening. Nobody planned this. Well, I should say, the average person who's being hunted down over this did not plan this. Trump did not plan this. Trump did not make anybody do anything against their will. People went there thinking it was going to be a protest, and it got hijacked by nefarious actors. And unfortunately, I must say also, there are normal people who just act out of character when they are in an ocean of other people acting the same way. That's just how human psychology works. And so we can't we it would be naive to say, or it would be naive to paint with a broad brush and say that everybody who did something even violent or destructive was there for that purpose. A lot of people got caught up just in the things that were going on around them. And a lot of people were also defending themselves from excessive police force. A lot of people were jumping into action, say, to protect their wife, or because they saw another citizen that was being abused, and they thought that it was their duty as a citizen to help their fellow man. It's very murky. There were bad actors there in the crowd that blended in, so it's not easy to. It would behoove us not to say something imprudent like everybody in the crowd was innocent, all the cops were bad, all the cops were doing their jobs, all the crowd were bad. That's not quite the case. It was a very convoluted and very mixed up thing. That's why it's taken so many years for people to even start asking questions about Ray Epps. And so it's just important for people to realize, I'm sorry to drone on, but there are so many people that have been exposed as informants, as Antifa, as undercover law enforcement, or agitators. It's very messy. And unfortunately, the average person has a normalcy bias, so they don't like messy. But from my experience, there were definitely people there who were not Trump supporters who were trying to get other people in trouble, and they succeeded, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of outside of observers see. And I can tell you, I've spoken at some events, and one event in particular recently in Fort Myers. Actually, Michael Thompson's here. He invited me to speak at his rec. In Lee County, wonderful rec, and he's an awesome chairman. If you guys aren't following Michael down below, make sure you do that. But we were at an event, and surprisingly, I think the majority of the questions for the panel, and it wasn't a January 6th panel, we were just talking about the upcoming election and all kinds of things. The majority of the questions were about January 6th. And, people are still, I think people see what's happening, and they just feel this sense of concern, not just because of what's happening to Trump, but because of what's happened to just normal Americans as well. And they see what's happening to Trump, and they see what's happening to, looks like yeah, they're still there. My speakers are moving around. I don't know who's talking to who's here anymore. But you see Trump and you see what they're doing to him, and you see the funny business the judge is doing over there, and then you see all these January 6th defendants, and some of them still getting arrested, being held in solitary confinement, being charged in forms that are very unfavorable to them. I think American sense of justice is really what people are so upset about. They live in a country where they feel like, we have this court system and you're innocent until proven guilty. And I think over the last couple of years, that idea of innocence, I feel like is lost. And in a system where it is so important that it's literally put into our constitution to have this system of justice, I think that's why so many people are still so upset about not January 6th and the way Trump's being treated in the courts. It's almost like a betrayal of one of the most fundamental ideas in our republic, and that's this idea of justice. And I think that goes to it. What are your thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I definitely want to address that. And this is that's absolutely what it is. I'll make I'll make 2 points here. The first is that, how do I phrase it? Okay, so without getting too into law, the 14th Amendment does talk about equal protection under the law, and there's this famous case called Yick Wo. And it basically lays the foundation, in my opinion, for what we would call selective prosecution. And so what the idea is that even if laws are legitimate laws, it is when they are used or weaponized against certain dissidents, whether it be ethnic, religious reasons, even for ideological reasons. That's when law becomes applied with an evil eye and an uneven hand. And so when we see the things that say BLM does or Antifa, and everybody likes to do the whataboutism, But that's really not that. That actually is a very important or a pertinent observation that certain leftist agitators and rioters get to burn the country to the ground, or even if it's Code Pink interrupting Senate hearings, or whether it's environmental radicals. When we were incarcerated in the D.C. jail, you had environmental riots in D.C. You had people who have used bike racks to ram into the police, and it's like, well, where are they in the jail? They're not there. It is important to understand that throughout our history, um, you can't have you can't have this double standard because historically the pendulum always swings in one direction or the other. And so one thing I point out, this might be an uncomfortable observation. When you look at the FBI, for instance, when you look at the way the feds and the government have treated left-wing groups, when you look at how unions used to be treated, when you look at how the civil rights movement was treated, when you look at how the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era, how that was treated, the feds used to target left-wing groups all the time. And now that the pendulum is swinging in the other direction, they think that it's okay to abuse their authority. But the pendulum can always swing back in the other direction. And so it's important that all Americans have the same standard for justice. Justice is supposed to be blind, yes, but it's not. It can't merely be about altruism. It's really just pragmatic. We have a constitutional system, and if we don't follow the standard, we just don't have it. But one thing I would say, getting away from that, is that it's 100% a plan to destroy President Donald Trump. And I won't dawdle on this too long, but I'll just say this: talking about the infiltration. President Trump is being charged with something called 18 USC 1512. All right, he's being charged with essentially, well, I'll say this. The 1512 charge originally was called tampering with witnesses. All right, it goes back to the 80s. But after the Enron scandal, a substatute was added, basically for the destruction of documents. Now, this has nothing to do with January 6th or President Trump, but after January 6th, the Department of Justice started applying this charge, 18 USC 1512, as a subcharge called obstruction of an official proceeding, to say that January 6th defendants, and then later President Trump, interfered with the certification vote, and therefore they needed to be charged with this obstruction charge. It's totally inapplicable, and it's in front of the Supreme Court now. Hopefully it's going to be tossed, and a lot of January 6th defendants will be vindicated, and President Trump will be vindicated as well in Washington, D.C. I mention this case so that your audience can understand the true extent of the infiltration and how much this has been framed in a certain way, and how the insurrection narrative is completely artificial and manufactured. The first two January 6 defendants to have 18 USC 1512 upheld in federal court were Nathan DeGrave and Ronald Sandlin. These co-defendants were at the Capitol on January 6 to get out of trouble for something they had done prior. Ronald Sandlin had told me and several other defendants inside the D.C. jail that his co-defendant, for instance, Nathan DeGrave, was caught in a drug conspiracy in 2020. So you have people who were in trouble before January 6th who were at the Capitol to cause problems so that they could actually get out of trouble with the feds. Not to get into trouble, but to get out of trouble. How many people do you think were at the Capitol because they were caught in a drug conspiracy? Or perhaps they had some form of we'll say other issues with the federal system. The feds do this kind of thing all the time, but they typically don't use it to entrap presidents. But that is, from my perspective, exactly what this is. This was a prearranged thing to target President Trump. It wasn't just to stop him on January 6th to bury the 2020 election. I think this was a long-term plan as well to stop him in 2024. The average American has no idea how many informants are a part of all this. So I don't want to focus so much on that, because there is the human element that we need to focus on, the families, the human cost, because January 6th wasn't just an entrapment scheme. January 6th is frankly a humanitarian disaster. But I always, because of my experience in the jail dealing with a lot of these people, I always try to focus on the legal aspect. It wasn't just January 6th defendants who were entrapped. I believe President Trump was entrapped as well.
Gosh, I was muted that whole time. Did you? um, were you guys sitting in radio silence? That's like the number one rule that I try not to violate. I'm sorry. No, I was gonna say, Tim, I agree with you. I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think the discussion is okay. And this is actually in the documentary that's coming out, the part two. I think, well, at least the part one that I saw on the website, on the Patriot Freedom Project website, that we could still have these conversations. And I think the most destructive part of January 6th was that we weren't even allowed to question the event. We weren't allowed to question the litigation. We weren't allowed to question anything without being banned or throttled or kicked out of platforms or even attacked by our peers. And I think that's probably one of the other things that came out of this that was just awful. And that and COVID, obviously, where you can't talk about that either. We got into a place in society where you can't dissent unless it's the popular dissent. And so I think you're absolutely right. People do feel this way.